Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about a single pressing question: how do we not die tonight? It wasn't just a season, it was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this: you're living in a tiny mud and stick hut with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin, and definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely less freezing inside. Congratulations, nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered pathetically, doing its best, but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside with worse snacks. The unforgiving medieval home. Let me paint you a clearer picture of what these homes actually looked like, because understanding the structure is the first step to understanding the struggle. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator that was always readily available, shall we say. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And peasants were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground, so technically you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. The heart of the home. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right, most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing or your overall lifespan, But on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Tell me in the comments, what do you do on cold winter nights? Read a book? Watch a movie? Stare at your phone like the rest of us? I'm curious how you spend your evenings compared to our medieval ancestors. The constant vigil, keeping the fire alive, wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty: stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire, but in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters? Dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep, with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive just barely until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some said use dry ash only. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight. Others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Drop a comment if you've ever tried to start a fire without matches. It's harder than it looks, right? Now imagine doing it with frostbitten fingers at 3 a.m. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway, or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals. Basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory right there. And enough to face another day of battling the cold. The warmth of community. In medieval times, the phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't just about parties, it was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked on moored into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations, muffled under a shared wool blanket. So, next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. Let me know in the comments if you have to fight for blankets in your house. I want to hear your bedtime battle stories, the original space heaters. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition, it was vital for survival. Lidstock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbor in the dead of night. Two birds, one stinky stone. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous. Far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that, but it's a cow, it's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smell was legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills, and cows cuddle whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. Have you ever slept with a pet in your bed? Imagine that times 10, with farm animals and no central heating. Drop a comment if your dog or cat is your personal space heater at night. The layered look. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then another, if you had it, and some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirticle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky for it. Let me know in the comments how many layers you're wearing right now. I'm genuinely curious. The insulation of filth in the medieval peasant playbook. Dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say, genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem. Heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, was surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in, as peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing. Layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective, holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. I bet you're glad you have access to hot showers right now. Drop a comment if you're appreciating modern plumbing after hearing that. The medieval mattress. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic, and by rustic I mean let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam. No orthopedic support. No five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stool. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating at its finest. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." Tell me in the comments, could you survive on a straw mattress for one night? Be honest. Plugging the leaks when you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine. This is luxury," because in a way, it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt, made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors and windows, if you had them, were lucky, but even then they were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, Medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. Have you ever had to deal with a drafty window or door in your house? Imagine if that was your entire wall. Drop a comment with your best DIY insulation hack. The shift system. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So, someone had to be on Ember Patrol, and since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons, just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and, frankly, because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. With people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard, getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m, wondering if toes were really that important. Let me know in the comments if you're a night owl or an early bird. Maybe your ancestors were shift workers too. The breath of life, you know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep open-mouth breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say Hail Mary, that was a risk nobody wanted to take. So, peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul, with no doctors in sight and grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warming barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding and the piles of cloaks, and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible. Like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. Take a deep breath right now. Appreciate that it's warm air. Drop a comment if you're grateful for central heating and warm bedrooms. The full belly strategy. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon, a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up, doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So, what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork, or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly prized, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard, peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh, but effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely, because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal. They were aiming to survive, and if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. What's your favorite comfort food on a cold night? Drop it in the comments. I'm taking notes. The hay box and the hot stone. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble hay box and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the hay box. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the hay box, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better, rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed, a medieval heating pad, ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small localized house fire, and if you dropped it on your foot, well, Let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle. Have you ever used a hot water bottle or heating pad? Same concept, just rockier. Drop a comment if you're a fan of old-school warming tricks. The fire hierarchy. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner, it was practically a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime real estate. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, and let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable, but it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed, or your cloak smouldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat, like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night, like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise. You're still alive. You're still warm for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. Where do you sleep in your house? Closest to the heat or farthest away? Drop a comment and let me know your preferred sleeping temperature. The village network. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair, it was a village project. A messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check, and not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly, who couldn't work the fields but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villagers sometimes pooled their last salted meat, grain and dried vegetables. It was grim charity. No one had much, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened. Disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. Do you have neighbors you can count on? Drop a comment and give a shout out to your community. It takes a village, even today, faith and superstition. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire, they prayed. A lot, because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than distant holy figures. They were winter's front-line defense. Saint Blaise, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments. Not a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul. Saint Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits or at the very least mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. Do you have any winter traditions or superstitions? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear how you welcome the cold season, when winter won. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough, and when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine winter of 1315, when rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and in the most horrifying cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families huddled together for the final time. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring, bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic. It was often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbors were already stretched to the breaking point. Disease loved the cold too. Starvation weakened the body, and cramped, smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." Yet, what's most haunting isn't just the death, it's the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter, some among them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Even amid the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life, because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. Take a moment to appreciate the simple fact that you're warm right now. Drop a comment if you're grateful for modern heating. The children of winter among the frozen bodies and collapsed huts. There was one sound that cut through the winter silence more painfully than any howling wind. The cry of a child who had lost everyone. Or worse, the silence of children who had gone with them. Medieval children were the most vulnerable during winter's worst assaults. Their small bodies lost heat faster than adults. Their developing immune systems stood little chance against the diseases that bred in cramped, smoky homes. And when food ran low, they were often the last to eat, not out of cruelty, but because the logic of survival demanded that the strongest be fed first so they could continue to work and provide for everyone. But here's the thing about medieval children. They were also the toughest little survivors you could ever imagine. From the moment they could walk, they were working. Gathering sticks for the fire, chasing chickens back into the house, carrying messages between neighbors, learning the 1,000 small skills that would keep them alive through winters to come. A 7-year-old in medieval England knew how to bank a fire. A 5-year-old in medieval France could tell you which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you by sundown. A 10-year-old in medieval Germany could handle a knife well enough to help with butchering, could spin wool into thread, could identify the first signs of frostbite in a younger sibling's toes. Childhood, as we understand it today, didn't exist. There were no snow days off from school because there was no school. There were no video games to play indoors because there was no electricity. There was just life and work and the constant grinding need to survive. And yet, they found moments of joy. Archaeologists have found crude toys in medieval villages, whistles carved from bone, tiny clay animals, dolls made of rags and straw. Children played in the mud when the weather allowed. They chased each other through the narrow village paths. They told stories and sang songs and probably annoyed their parents just as much as children do today. But winter was different. Winter was different. Winter meant staying inside, staying quiet, staying still. A child who ran around burned calories that couldn't be replaced. A child who shouted used up energy that the body needed for warmth. Winter children learned to sit by the fire for hours, playing silent games, speaking in whispers, learning patience because patience meant survival. When winter won, it often took the children first. A mother would wake to find her infant cold and still beside her. A father would watch his son's cough turn into something darker, something that rattled in the small chest and wouldn't let go. A grandmother would hold a grandchild through the night and feel the little body grow colder, despite her best efforts to share her warmth. And then spring would come, and the survivors would bury their dead in ground that had finally softened enough to dig. They would mark the graves with simple stones or wooden crosses. They would plant crops over the bodies of their loved ones, because life had to continue, because the dead would want the living to eat, because in the medieval world, death and life were woven together in ways we can barely comprehend. The children who survived grew up hard and wise. They knew things that no modern child could imagine. They knew the weight of a frozen body. They knew the smell of hunger. They knew that love meant holding someone close through the night and hoping you both wake up. And they passed that knowledge to their own children, who passed it to theirs, generation after generation, until the memories softened into stories, and the stories faded into history. And we sit here tonight with our central heating and our warm blankets, barely able to imagine what they endured, the animals that didn't make it. We've talked about how livestock shared the peasant home, their bodies radiating precious warmth through the long winter nights. But not every animal survived. And when an animal died in winter, it wasn't just a loss of warmth, it was a catastrophe. A cow represented years of investment. The cost of buying or breeding it, the hay and grass fed to it through multiple seasons. The labor of caring for it, milking it, protecting it. A cow was wealth incarnate, walking around on four legs, producing milk and cheese and butter, and eventually, leather and meaty. When a cow died in winter, the family didn't just lose future milk. They lost their savings account. They lost their insurance policy. They lost the animal that would have produced the calf that would have grown into the next cow that would have sustained them for years to come. And so peasants fought desperately to keep their animals alive. They shared their own food with them when grain was scarce. They brought them inside at the first sign of extreme cold. They sat up at night with sick animals, applying poultices and forcing liquids down their throats and praying to every saint who might listen. Sometimes it worked. The cow recovered, the goat pulled through, the chicken survived to lay eggs in spring. But sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, the family faced impossible choices. Do they butcher the dying animal immediately, salvaging what meat they could before it was lost entirely? Or do they wait, hoping for a miracle that probably wouldn't come? Do they share the meat with neighbors who might share back when their own animals died? Or do they keep every scrap for themselves, knowing that hoarding now might mean resentment later? And then there was the question of preservation. Meat could be salted, smoked, or dried, but all of those methods required resources that might also be scarce. Salt was expensive. Smoking required fuel that was already being carefully rationed. Drying required air that was cold enough to freeze, but dry enough not to rot the meat. A narrow window that didn't always align with the timing of an animal's death. Some families made the choice to slaughter early, before winter got bad enough to kill the animal on its own. They would butcher a pig or a sheep in late autumn, processing the meat into sausages and hams and salted joints that would last through the cold months. This was smart. This was planning. This was how you survived. But it also meant that the animal's warmth was gone from the house. That living, breathing radiator that would have shared the family's space through the winter nights was now hanging from the rafters as meat, providing calories but not heat. It was a trade-off. And different families made different choices based on their specific circumstances. The smell of death hung over medieval villages in winter. Not just the smell of butchered meat, but the smell of animals that hadn't made it. Their bodies frozen solid, waiting for spring to reveal what had been lost. Dogs would dig at the edges of middens where carcasses had been thrown. Ravens gathered in the bare trees, watching, waiting. And through it all, the peasants kept going. They milked the surviving cows. They fed the remaining chickens. They mucked out the stalls where the goats huddled together for warmth. They did what had to be done because there was no other choice. The winter kitchen. Let's talk about food, because food was literally a matter of life and death in medieval winter. And not just any food, but specifically food that could be preserved, stored, and stretched through months when nothing grew. The medieval peasant's winter diet was nothing like what we eat today. It was repetitive, monotonous, and often barely palatable. But it kept people alive, and in the world of medieval winter, that was enough. Grains formed the backbone of winter eating. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, all harvested in late summer and carefully stored in dry places where mice and moisture couldn't reach them. These grains were ground into flour when there was time and energy, or simply boiled whole into a kind of porridge that could be flavored with whatever was available. Bread was the staff of life, but winter bread wasn't the soft, fluffy loaf we know today. It was dense, dark, and often mixed with whatever other ground materials were available. Chestnuts could be dried and ground into flour. Acorns could be leached of their tannins and added to the mix. In desperate times, the bark of certain trees could be scraped and ground into something that resembled flour and would fill the stomach if not provide much nutrition. Vegetables that stored well were precious. Onions and garlic hung in braids from the rafters. Cabbages could be kept for months in cool storage. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots were buried in sand or earth in cellars, where they would stay fresh through much of the winter. Leeks and other hardy greens might survive in the garden, under straw or snow, ready to be pulled when needed. Legumes were survival food. Dried peas, beans, and lentils could be stored for years if kept dry. They were boiled into soups and stews that formed the base of countless winter meals. A pot of pea soup with a bit of bacon fat could feed a family for days, each reheating, adding a little more water, a little more grain, stretching the food further and further. Meat was rare in winter for most peasants. The animals that survived were too valuable to kill, and the meat that had been preserved in autumn was used sparingly. A few slices of bacon here, a bit of salt pork there, just enough to add flavour to the endless pots of grain and vegetable stew. Fish could be had in some areas, either from nearby rivers or from the sea if the village was coastal. But fishing in winter was dangerous work. Ice had to be broken. Boats had to be launched in freezing conditions. The catch might be meagre, and the risk of falling into freezing water was ever present. Dairy products were available as long as the animals were producing. Milk could be drunk fresh or turned into cheese that would keep for months. Butter could be made and stored in cool places, or salted to extend its life even further. These were luxuries, sources of fat and protein that made the grain-heavy diet more sustainable. And then there were the foraged foods, nuts collected in autumn and stored in shells, dried mushrooms strung on threads, wild herbs that could flavour even the blandest pottage, rose hips and hawthorn berries, rich in vitamin C, gathered before the birds could get them and used to make teas and conserves. The winter kitchen was a place of constant calculation. How much flour remained? How many turnips? Would the cheese last until spring? Could they afford to kill the last chicken, or should they keep it for eggs? Every meal was a decision. Every portion a choice between eating today and eating tomorrow. Women bore the brunt of this mental load. They were the ones who knew exactly how much food remained in the storehouses. They were the ones who stretched the meals, who added more water to the pot, who went hungry themselves so that children and working men could eat. They were the ones who watched the food supplies dwindle as winter dragged on, who calculated and recalculated, who prayed that spring would come before the last grain was gone. And sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the calculations failed. Sometimes the food ran out with weeks still to go before the first greens could be harvested. And then came the true horror of medieval winter: starvation. The slow death of starvation. Starvation doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly, day by day, week by week, taking little pieces of a person until nothing is left. Medieval peasants knew this progression intimately, had watched it happen to neighbours, to family members, and sometimes felt it happening to themselves. The first sign was weakness. The tasks that had been manageable became difficult. Carrying water from the well left you breathless. Splitting wood exhausted you for hours. You slept more, moved less, conserved every calorie because your body had nothing left to burn. Then came the wasting. The body began to consume itself, burning fat first, then muscle. Faces grew gaunt. Arms became sticks. Bellies might swell with edema, a cruel irony that made the starving look almost well-fed. Clothes that had fit became loose, then loose enough to share, then just rags hanging on bones. The cold became unbearable. Without food to fuel the body's internal furnace, even a mild chill could feel like freezing. People huddled closer to fires that barely warmed them, wrapped themselves in layers that no longer had flesh to insulate. They shivered constantly, a low-level tremor that never stopped, that shook them even in what passed for sleep. Thoughts grew slow and strange. The mind, deprived of fuel, began to play tricks. People became obsessed with food, dreaming of feasts, hallucinating meals that weren't there. They might become irritable or childlike, or simply withdraw into themselves, staring at nothing for hours. Children stopped growing, their development halted, bodies conserving everything for the bare minimum of survival. They became listless, uninterested in play, content to lie by the fire and stare at the flames. Some never caught up, even when food returned. The damage of winter starvation could last a lifetime. In the final stages, the body simply gave up. Organs failed. The heart, too weak to pump, stopped beating. The starving person slipped away quietly, often in sleep, leaving behind a body so reduced that it barely seemed human. Families watched this happen to their loved ones and could do nothing. They had no food to give. They had no medicine to offer. They had only their presence, their hands to hold, their voices to whisper prayers that might or might not be heard. And when the dying was over, they had to deal with the body. Frozen ground couldn't be dug. Corpses might have to be stored somewhere until spring, a grim reminder of winter's toll. Some villages had special buildings for this purpose, cold storage for the dead until they could be properly buried. The survivors carried on because they had to. There were still children to feed, still animals to tend, still fires to keep. Grief was a luxury they couldn't afford. They mourned when spring came, when the ground softened and the graves could be dug, when they had time to remember the ones who hadn't made it. The Great Hunger. Let me tell you about a specific winter, because the general story of suffering can blur together, but individual winters had their own character, their own horrors, their own place in history. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the worst periods in European history. It wasn't just one winter. It was 2 years of relentless disaster that killed millions and changed the course of nations. It started with the weather. In the spring of 1315, it began to rain, and it didn't stop. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the rain fell across northern Europe. Crops rotted in the fields. Hay couldn't be harvested. Grain turned black with mold before it could be cut. By autumn, the extent of the disaster was clear. There would be no harvest. The stores from previous years were already low. Millions of people faced a winter with no food. The rain continued through the winter, turning snow to slush, saturating the ground so that nothing could be planted even when spring supposedly arrived. The planting season of 1316 came and went with barely a seed in the ground. The famine would continue. People ate anything. They ground bark into flour and baked it into bread that gave them stomach pains but filled the void. They boiled leather and tried to chew it. They dug up roots that weren't meant to be eaten and died from the poisons. They ate their seed grain, knowing it meant no crops next year because the alternative was dying now. Chroniclers of the time recorded horrors. In Ireland, people were said to have eaten each other. In England, parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. In Germany, the poor dug up fresh graves and ate the bodies. Whether these stories were literally true or exaggerated by terrified observers, they capture something real about the desperation of those years. The weak died first. The old, the young, the sick, they went in waves. But as the famine continued, the strong died too. Farmers who had worked the land their whole lives, blacksmiths who could shoe a horse and forge a plough, mothers who had raised half a dozen children to adulthood. None of them were immune to starvation. By the time the rains finally stopped and the harvests returned, Europe had been transformed. Perhaps 10% of the population was dead. Whole villages stood empty. Fields that had been cultivated for generations lay fallow, their farmers buried in mass graves, and the survivors were changed. They had seen what hunger could do. They had made choices that haunted them. They had watched their world collapse and somehow kept breathing. The Great Famine would be followed by other disasters, most notably the Black Death, which would kill even more people a generation later. But for those who lived through it, the famine was the defining experience. It taught them that civilization was fragile, that the old certainties couldn't be trusted, that a bad stretch of weather could undo everything they built. The psychology of survival, Let's step back from the specific horrors and think about something more abstract but just as important. How did medieval peasants maintain the will to survive? What kept them going through nights so cold they could feel their toes freezing, through days so hungry they could barely stand, through losses that would break most modern people entirely? Part of it was simply that they had no choice. Giving up meant dying, and dying meant leaving your children alone, your animals untended, your fire unbanked. The responsibilities of life pressed on them even in extremis, pushing them forward when they might otherwise have stopped. But there was more to it than duty. Medieval peasants had a worldview that made suffering meaningful in ways that are hard for us to grasp. Their Christianity taught them that earthly life was a test, a pilgrimage, a preparation for something better. Suffering wasn't meaningless. It was purification. It was participation in the suffering of Christ. It was the path to salvation. This wasn't just abstract theology. It was lived reality. When a peasant lost a child to winter cold, they didn't just grieve, they prayed for that child's soul, confident that the little one was now in heaven, free from the pain and hunger that marked earthly existence. When they themselves suffered, they offered it up to God, making their pain into a kind of prayer. Their communities reinforced this worldview. Neighbors reminded each other of God's love, even in the darkest times. Priests preached sermons about endurance and hope. The rituals of the church, the mass, the prayers, the feast days of saints, structured time and gave meaning to the passing seasons. But there was also a more practical kind of resilience. Medieval peasants were not naive. They knew that life was hard and death was common. They didn't expect comfort or security. They expected struggle, and they were prepared for it in ways that we are not. A modern person facing a medieval winter would probably break within days. The cold alone would be overwhelming. The lack of privacy, the constant smoke, the inadequate food, the ever-present threat of death, all of it would be too much. We have been softened by centuries of progress, by central heating and supermarkets and modern medicine. But medieval peasants were hardened by centuries of exactly the opposite. They were born into cold and hunger. They were raised with death as a constant companion. They learned from infancy that life required effort, that nothing was guaranteed, that winter was an enemy to be fought and survived. This doesn't mean they didn't feel fear or grief. Of course they did. The sources are full of evidence of their emotions, their love for each other, their terror at what winter might bring, their sorrow when it took someone they loved. They were human beings, as fully human as we are, with all the emotional depth that implies. But their humanity expressed itself differently. They didn't have the luxury of extended grief. They couldn't afford to fall apart. When winter took a child, they had to keep going, for the sake of the other children, for the animals, for the community that depended on them. Their resilience wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The coming of spring, and then, eventually, spring would come. Not all at once, but gradually, in signs that peasants watched for with an intensity we can barely imagine. The first sign was the light. Days grew longer, imperceptibly at first, then noticeably. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays carrying just a hint of warmth. The worst of the cold was over, though there would still be frosts, still snow, still plenty of winter left. Then came the sounds. Water dripping from eaves as ice began to melt. Birds returning, their songs filling air that had been silent for months. The lowing of animals let out to pasture, feeling the sun on their backs for the first time since autumn. And then the smells, earth thawing after months of freezing, releasing the scent of mud and growth. The first green shoots pushing through the soil, tender and precious. Smoke from fires that no longer needed to burn quite so fiercely. Spring meant work. The fields had to be prepared, the seeds planted, the gardens dug. Animals had to be moved to fresh pasture, fences repaired, tools readied for the growing season. There was no rest after winter's ordeal. There was only more work, different work, the work of life rather than survival. But spring also meant hope. The stores might be nearly empty, but soon there would be fresh greens, milk from animals fattened on new grass, eggs from chickens that had survived. The worst was over. Another winter had been survived. life would continue. Peasants celebrated spring in ways that mixed Christian and pagan traditions. Easter was the great celebration, the resurrection of Christ, mirroring the resurrection of the land. But there were older festivals too. May Day with its dancing and maypoles, celebrations of fertility and growth that went back centuries before Christianity arrived. Children who had been cooped up all winter ran wild in the fields, relearning the joy of movement, of space, of being outdoors. Young people courted and married, the spring weddings making up for the ceremonies postponed by winter. Communities came together for feasts that used up the last of the stored food, trusting that fresh supplies would soon arrive. And in the fields, the first shoots of grain pushed through the soil, green and tender, vulnerable to late frosts and hungry birds, but alive, growing, promising. The cycle would begin again: summer's growth, autumn's harvest, winter's trial, spring's renewal. Over and over, generation after generation, the peasants lived and died and lived again in the eternal return of the seasons. The knowledge keepers. Someone had to remember. Someone had to know which winters had been bad and which mild, which fields produced best and which were prone to frost, which animals survived and which didn't. That someone was usually the old women of the village. In medieval peasant society, old women occupied a complex position. They were respected for their knowledge, but sometimes feared for their power. They knew things that others didn't. They remembered winters past. They could read the signs of weather in the flight of birds and the behavior of animals. They knew which herbs cured which ailments and which plants killed. This knowledge was practical, not magical, though the line between the two was blurry in medieval minds. An old woman who could ease a fever with a poultice might also be suspected of causing the fever in the first place. The same knowledge that made her valuable also made her dangerous in the eyes of some. But in winter, suspicion often gave way to need. When a child was sick, you went to the old woman. When the cow wouldn't eat, you asked the old woman. When you needed to know whether the winter would break early or late, you listened to what the old woman said. These women were the libraries of their communities, carrying knowledge that had been passed down through generations. They knew which mushrooms were safe and which deadly, which roots could be dug in winter and which had to wait for spring, which barks made medicine and which made poison. They knew the signs of impending death and, sometimes, how to forestall it. Young women learned from them, apprenticing in the arts of healing and preserving and presifing and predicting. The knowledge passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, adapting and changing as conditions changed, but maintaining a core of wisdom that stretched back centuries. When an old woman died, something died with her. All that knowledge, all those memories, all that hard-won wisdom, gone, unless she had managed to pass it on. Communities mourned these losses almost as much as they mourned the woman herself, because they knew that winter would come again and her knowledge would be needed. Some of what they knew has been lost forever. The exact recipes for herbal remedies, the specific signs that predicted weather, the techniques for preserving food without salt or smoking, all of it gone because no one wrote it down. But some has survived, passed down through families, recorded by curious monks, preserved in folk traditions that continue to this day. When you use a home remedy your grandmother taught you, you're connecting to that medieval past. When you predict weather by looking at the sky or watching animals, you're using knowledge the peasants developed over centuries of close observation. The old women of the Middle Ages live on in these small ways, their wisdom still present though their names are forgotten. The monastic exception. Before we get too deep into the peasant experience, let's acknowledge that not everyone in medieval times lived like this. The monks and nuns in their monasteries had a very different relationship with winter. Monasteries were typically better built than peasant huts. Stone walls, glass windows, proper fireplaces with chimneys, all the things that peasants lacked. Monks had multiple layers of clothing, often of good quality wool. They had regular meals, stored in proper granaries and cellars. They had infirmaries, where the sick could be cared for in relative comfort. But even monasteries struggled in winter. Heating a large stone building is difficult even with good fireplaces. The cloisters where monks walked and studied were freezing. The churches where they prayed 8 times a day were cold enough to see their breath. Frost formed on the inside of windows. Ink froze in its pots, forcing scribes to warm it over candles. Monks developed their own winter strategies. They wore additional layers under their habits, sometimes bending the rules of their orders to stay warm. They heated stones to put under their feet while they worked. They huddled together in the scriptorium, sharing what warmth they had. And they wrote. Thank God they wrote. The chronicles and records kept by monasteries are our best sources for understanding medieval winters. Monks noted when the Thames froze over, when crops failed, when the poor died in droves. They recorded the prayers they said for those suffering from cold and hunger. They copied and preserved the agricultural knowledge that peasants needed to survive. Some monasteries actively helped peasants during bad winters. They distributed food from their stalls, provided shelter for the homeless, offered medical care to the sick. This wasn't pure altruism. Monasteries depended on peasants for labor and food. Keeping them alive was in the monastery's interest. But it was also part of the monastic vocation, the duty to care for the poor and suffering. The relationship between monastery and village was complex, full of mutual dependence and occasional conflict. Peasants resented paying tithes and taxes to the monastery. Monks resented peasants who poached from monastic lands or failed to deliver what they owed. But in winter, these tensions often eased, replaced by a shared struggle against the cold. When spring came, the monks would emerge from their monasteries, blinking in the sunlight, and survey the damage. How many peasants had survived? How many fields would go unplanted? How many mouths would need feeding through the coming year? The calculations were different from those made by peasants, but just as urgent: the lord's winter. And then there were the nobles, the lords and ladies who lived in castles and manor houses. Their experience of winter was different again from both peasants and monks. A noble's home was built for defense as much as comfort. Thick stone walls that kept out enemies but also kept in some warmth. Castles had multiple fireplaces, sometimes one in every major room. They had tapestries on the walls that provided insulation as well as decoration. They had glazed windows that let in light while keeping out drafts. Nobles had wardrobes full of clothing, wool and linen and fur and silk. They had multiple layers to wear, garments for different occasions, cloaks lined with expensive materials. They had shoes and boots made by professional craftsmen, fitted to their feet and designed to keep out moisture. They had food, lots of food. The lord's larders were stocked with grain and meat and cheese and wine, enough to feed not just the noble family but their entire household of servants and retainers. They had preserves and pickles and salted meats and dried fruits. They had spices imported from the east to enliven winter meals. But even nobles suffered in winter. Castles were draughty, the wind whistling through arrow slits and around ill-fitting doors. Stone walls stayed cold, radiating chill even when fires blazed. The great halls where everyone gathered were cavernous spaces that no fire could fully warm. Nobles spent winter in close quarters with their households, the same lack of privacy that peasants experience but with more comfortable surroundings. They entertained themselves with music and games and storytelling. They planned for the coming year's campaigns and marriages and political maneuvers. They waited, just like everyone else, for spring. The gap between noble and peasant experience was enormous, but winter was a great leveler in some ways. It didn't matter how rich you were when the roads became impassable and supplies couldn't move. It didn't matter how powerful you were when disease swept through your household. It didn't matter how many servants you had when the cold seeped through every wall. Nobles died in winter too. Their children sickened and died. Their old people faded away. Their animals perished despite better shelter and feed. Money couldn't buy immunity from the fundamental challenges of winter, but it could buy a better chance. And that chance translated into higher survival rates, healthier bodies, stronger children. The noble class survived winters better than peasants, and over generations, this advantage compounded. The rich got richer, not just in money, but in bodies, in lives, in futures. The forest's gift beyond the village, beyond the fields, lay the forest. To medieval peasants, the forest was many things. A source of resources, a place of danger, a home to wild beasts and wilder men, a refuge in times of trouble. In winter, the forest offered gifts to those brave or desperate enough to seek them. Wood for the fire, first and foremost. Fallen branches could be gathered without cutting living trees. But sometimes living trees had to be cut anyway. The forest provided fuel, and fuel meant life. Game could be hunted, though hunting was often restricted to nobles. Peasants who poached risked severe punishment, but hungry people take risks. A deer or wild boar could feed a family for weeks. Rabbits and hares could be trapped. Birds could be snared. Nuts and berries might still be found, stored by squirrels or hidden in hollow logs. Mushrooms grew even in cold weather. Evergreen needles could be brewed into tea rich in vitamin C. The forest was a pantry for those who knew how to read it. But the forest was also dangerous. Wolves grew bold in winter, approaching villages when hunger drove them. Wild boar were aggressive and could kill a person with their tusks. Getting lost in the woods meant death. Disorientation in the featureless white of snow, cold creeping in as night fell. And then there were the supernatural dangers. Medieval people believed the forest was full of spirits, some friendly, most not. Woodwives and wild men, fairies and demons, creatures that lured travelers from the path and ate them or worse. These beliefs weren't just stories. They shaped behavior, kept people cautious, gave the forest a psychic weight that matched its physical dangers. Despite all this, peasants went to the forest when they had to. When the woodpile ran low, when the stew pot needed meat, when desperation outweighed fear, they went in groups, armed with axes and knives and crucifixes, praying as they walked, watching the shadows for movement. Sometimes the forest gave freely, a deer dead from cold, its meat frozen and waiting, a hollow tree full of honey, the bees dormant and harmless, a thicket of hazel with nuts still clinging to branches. Sometimes the forest took a child who wandered too far and never returned, a hunter who misjudged a boar and died in the snow, a woodcutter who fell and broke his leg, freezing to death before help could arrive. The forest was neither friend nor enemy, it simply was, and peasants dealt with it as they dealt with winter itself, with caution, with respect, with whatever tools they had. The village at night. Let's go back to the village on a winter night, because I want you to really see it, not as a historical abstraction, but as a real place where real people lived and suffered and survived. The sun has set hours ago. Darkness is absolute. The kind of darkness that doesn't exist anymore in our world of light pollution and street lamps. You can't see your hand in front of your face. You can't see the person standing next to you. You can only hear them, feel them, know they're there by the warmth of their body and the sound of their breathing. The houses are dark shapes against a darker sky, their thatched roofs barely visible as deeper blackness. From each house, a thin thread of smoke rises, carrying the smell of burning wood and something cooking, maybe, if there's food to cook. Inside one house, a family huddles around the fire. The flames are low, banked for the night, but they still cast enough light to see faces, to count the people who are still there. Mother, father, 3 children, grandmother. The cow stands in her corner, chewing contentedly, her warmth radiating into the room. The chickens have roosted in the rafters, their soft clucking a background noise that everyone has long stopped noticing. The children are quiet, not because they're well behaved, but because they've learned that noise wastes energy. They sit close to their mother, sharing her warmth, watching the fire. The grandmother tells a story, something from her own childhood, a winter worse than this one, a survival that seemed impossible. Her voice is soft, rhythmic, hypnotic. The children listen, half dreaming. Outside, the wind picks up. It whistles through the cracks that couldn't be fully plugged, stirs the thatch on the roof, moans around the corners of the house. The family ignores it. They've heard it 1,000 times. The wind is just the wind. It can't get in if they don't let it. The father gets up to check the fire, adding a small piece of wood, adjusting the ash. He's done this 1,000 times too. His hands move automatically, his mind elsewhere, maybe on the spring planting, maybe on the debts he owes, maybe on nothing at all. He settles back down and the family shifts, rearranging themselves around the warmth. The grandmother's story continues. The fire crackles. The cow shifts in her sleep. The wind howls outside. This is the medieval winter night. Not dramatic, not eventful, just ordinary. Just life. Just survival. And in houses across the village, the same scene plays out with variations. More children in some, fewer in others. A pig instead of a cow. A father who drinks too much. A mother who's pregnant again. A grandfather who coughs and can't stop. The same fire, the same darkness, the same waiting for dawn. Some of these families won't all make it to morning. The old man's cough will turn to pneumonia. The baby will get too cold despite everything. The fire will die despite careful banking. Come daylight, neighbors will find the bodies and do what needs to be done. But most will make it. Most will wake to another grey winter morning, to the same cold, the same hunger, the same struggle. And they'll do it all over again, because that's what life is. That's what survival means. The children's games. Even in the darkest winter, children found ways to play. Not the elaborate structured play of modern kids, but simple games that used whatever was at hand and burned as few calories as possible. Stones could be arranged and rearranged for hours, creating patterns and stories that existed only in the children's minds. Sticks became people, animals, knights, dragons. The fire's flames were a living storybook, shapes shifting and dancing, suggesting adventures that never ended. Guessing games required nothing but voices. I spy, in a world with very limited options, riddles passed down through generations. Songs that everyone knew, sung in whispers so as not to disturb the adults or waste energy. Physical play was minimal, saved for times when the weather allowed outdoor activity. But even on the coldest days, children might venture out for short periods, bundled in whatever scraps of cloth could be spared. Their breath forming clouds as they ran through the snow. They built snow structures, crude forts and snowmen, though these activities were limited by the need to conserve energy. They slid down hills on pieces of wood or bark, laughing despite the cold. They threw snow at each other in battles that sometimes involved the whole village's youth. These games served a purpose beyond amusement. They kept children active enough to maintain muscle tone and circulation. They provided vitamin D from whatever weak sun penetrated the winter gloom. They gave children a reason to keep going, to look forward to something, to imagine a future beyond the next meal. And they taught skills. Throwing snow accurately was practice for throwing stones at predators or pests. Running through snow built endurance for the work that would come in spring. Negotiating the rules of games developed social skills that would serve children their whole lives. The games also created memories. Adults looking back on their childhoods would remember winter games fondly, the joy of play somehow surviving despite the hardship that surrounded it. These memories sustained them through later winters, reminded them that life wasn't just suffering, that joy was possible even in the darkest times. The old and the young winter sorted people ruthlessly. The very old and the very young were most vulnerable, their bodies less able to cope with cold and hunger. Families knew this and did what they could to protect them, but sometimes it wasn't enough. The elderly carried knowledge that was irreplaceable. They remembered which winters had been bad and which mild. They knew the signs of coming weather. They had techniques for preserving food, treating illness, keeping animals alive. Their deaths were not just personal losses, but communal ones. Families kept their old people as close to the fire as possible. They gave them the warmest sleeping spots, the most food, the most attention. Grandparents were treasures, and everyone knew it. But age took its toll regardless. Bodies that had survived 50 or 60 winters, an extraordinary age in medieval terms, simply wore out. The cold that a young person could shrug off settled into old bones and stayed. The cough that a child might shake off turned into pneumonia that killed within days. When an elder died in winter, the family grieved but couldn't stop. There was work to do, children to tend, animals to feed. The death would be marked properly when spring came, with a funeral and prayers, and maybe a small feast if food allowed. For now, there was only survival. The young were equally vulnerable. Babies couldn't regulate their own temperature well. Children burned through energy quickly and needed constant feeding. The youngest ones couldn't articulate what was wrong, couldn't say, "I'm cold" or "I'm hungry," in ways that adults could always interpret. Mothers watched their children with an intensity that modern parents can barely imagine. Every cough was analyzed. Every flush of cheeks might be fever. Every moment of stillness could be the beginning of the end. They counted breaths, counted feeds, counted days until spring. Children who survived winter emerged tougher, more resilient, more aware of the stakes. They had learned lessons that no one needed to teach them. They knew that cold could kill, that hunger was real, that the fire had to be fed. They were ready for the next winter, and the next, and all the winters that would follow, until they themselves became the old ones, huddled by the fire, telling stories to children who would someday tell stories about them. The spring planting, and then, finally, it was over. The snow melted, the ground thawed. The days grew long enough to work from dawn to dusk. Winter had been survived, and now it was time to plant. The first task was assessing the damage. Who had died? Which animals had been lost? How much seed grain remained? The answers to these questions determined everything that would happen in the coming months. Families who had lost members would need help. Neighbors would step in, plowing fields for widows, planting gardens for orphans. The communal bonds that had been tested by winter now proved their worth in spring. Fields had to be prepared. The ground, frozen for months, needed turning. Manure had to be spread. Old crops had to be cleared. It was back-breaking work made more urgent by the knowledge that any delay meant less food next winter. Seeds went into the ground with prayers and blessings. Priests walked through fields sprinkling holy water. Families said prayers over their garden plots. The same faith that had sustained them through winter now asked for spring's blessing. And then they waited, watched the sky for rain, watched the soil for the first green shoots, watched their children for signs of the strength that would be needed for the work ahead. Spring was busy, but it was a good busy. The kind of busy that meant life, growth, hope. The kind of busy that made winter's hardship almost worth it. But even as they planted, peasants remembered. They remembered the cold that had killed. They remembered the hunger that had gnawed. They remembered the faces of those who hadn't made it, and they began preparing for next winter, because next winter would come, and they would need to be ready. They repaired their houses, plugging the cracks that had let in drafts. They gathered extra fuel, storing it where it would stay dry. They preserved food, salted meat, dried apples, filled their larders with anything that would keep. The cycle continued. It would always continue. Winter after winter, spring after spring, generation after generation. The peasants worked and suffered and survived, passing their knowledge and their resilience to children who would do the same. The wisdom of the seasons, centuries of this cycle taught peasants things that we have forgotten. They knew in their bones that life was cyclical, that hardship was normal, that survival required community. They knew that winter would come whether they were ready or not, that preparation was not optional, that the only way through was together. They knew that food was precious, that nothing should be wasted, that a full stomach today meant nothing if it meant empty stores in February. They knew that fuel was life, that a fire couldn't be taken for granted, that every piece of wood counted. They knew that bodies needed each other, that warmth shared was warmth multiplied, that isolation meant death. They knew that children were the future, that their survival was the whole point, that everything they did was for the next generation. They knew that death was normal, that loss was inevitable, that grief couldn't stop the work. They knew that spring would come, that life would continue, that the world would turn regardless of individual suffering. This knowledge wasn't written down. It wasn't taught in schools. It was lived, experienced, passed from parent to child in the long winter nights, in the spring planting, in the autumn harvest. It was encoded in their bodies, in their habits, in their very being. We have lost most of this knowledge. We live in a world where food appears in stores, where heat comes from thermostats, where death is hidden in hospitals and funeral homes. We have forgotten that winter can kill, that hunger is real, that survival requires effort. But traces remain. In the way we stock up before a storm, in the way we huddle together when the power goes out, in the way we feel, deep down, that winter is something to be gotten through rather than enjoyed. The peasant's wisdom echoes in us, faint but present, a memory of times when survival wasn't guaranteed, the unbroken chain. Every person alive today with European ancestry descends from peasants who survived medieval winters. Not just one winter, but hundreds of them, generation after generation, stretching back to the dawn of agriculture and beyond. Think about that. Every one of your ancestors, going back thousands of years, survived winter. They survived cold and hunger and disease. They survived the death of children and parents and friends. They survived when so many others didn't. You are the product of that survival. Your body carries the genes of people who were tough enough, lucky enough, resourceful enough to make it through. Your psychology has been shaped by millennia of winters, by the constant pressure to prepare, to cooperate, to endure. When you feel anxious about the future, that's your ancestors speaking. When you stock up on supplies before a storm, that's their wisdom. When you gather with family on cold nights, that's their instinct. You are medieval peasants, still surviving, still enduring, still fighting the long war against winter. The circumstances have changed. You have central heating and supermarkets and modern medicine, but the fundamental challenge remains the same: to survive, to protect your loved ones, to make it through to spring. The peasants would recognize you. They would see in you the same fears and hopes that animated their own lives. They would understand your love for your children, your dread of disaster, your determination to keep going no matter what. They would know you as kin, as descendants, as proof that their struggle mattered. And they would be proud. Proud that you exist. Proud that their suffering led to something. Proud that the chain remains unbroken. The silence of the snow. Let's end where we began, with a winter night. Not the worst night. Not the night when winter wins, but an ordinary night. A night like thousands of others. Snow has fallen through the afternoon, covering the village in a thick white blanket. It muffles all sound, creating a silence so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat. The houses are buried almost to their windows, their roofs invisible under the weight of white. Inside one house, a family sleeps. The fire has been banked, its embers blowing faintly beneath a layer of ash. The cow breathes slowly, steadily, her warmth filling the room. The chickens roost silently, their heads tucked under wings. The children are curled together like puppies, their small bodies generating heat that keeps them all alive. The parents lie on either side, protecting them from drafts, ready to wake at the slightest sound. The grandmother, the one who tells stories, sleeps closest to the fire, her face peaceful in the dim glow. Outside, the snow continues to fall. It piles against the door, against the walls, against the window covered with animal hide. It creates a barrier between the family and the cold, insulation that the peasants didn't plan but gladly accept. The wind has died. The wind has died. The wind has held its breath, and in the darkness, in the cold, in the silence, the family sleeps. They sleep because they're tired. They sleep because they're warm enough. They sleep because tomorrow will bring more work, more struggle, more life. They sleep because they're alive. And that's the thing about medieval peasants. Against all odds, against everything winter could throw at them, they stayed alive. They endured. They persisted. They refused to die. The snow will melt. Spring will come. The cycle will continue. But tonight, in this moment, there is only the silence and the snow and the sleeping family. There is only survival, quiet and undramatic and absolutely miraculous. There is only life, refusing to give up, burning on like a banked fire, waiting for dawn, the tools of survival. Let's talk about the physical objects that made survival possible, the tools that medieval peasants used to fight winter, passed down through generations, maintained with care, valued beyond measure. The axe was perhaps the most important. Without an axe, you couldn't cut wood. Without wood, you couldn't have fire. Without fire, you died. Axes were treasured, sharpened constantly, protected from rust and theft. A good axe could last a lifetime, could be passed from father to son, could mean the difference between survival and death. The flint and steel for starting fires were almost as precious. These small tools were kept close to the body, protected from moisture, guarded against loss. To lose your fire-starting kit was a catastrophe, potentially fatal. Families without flint and steel had to borrow from neighbors, beg for embers, hope that someone would share. The cooking pot hung over the fire was more than just cookware. It was the center of the household, the vessel that transformed raw ingredients into edible food. A good pot was expensive, hard to replace. It was treated with respect, cleaned carefully, never left where it could be damaged. The sickle or scythe for harvesting grain was seasonal, but essential. Without it, you couldn't bring in the crops that would feed you through winter. These tools were sharpened and stored carefully, their blades protected from rust, their handles smoothed by generations of use. The spinning wheel or distaff allowed women to turn wool into thread, thread into cloth, cloth into clothing. Without warm clothing, winter was deadly. The tools of textile production were as important as any farming implement. The plough, if a family was wealthy enough to own one, was a treasure beyond price. It turned the soil that grew the grain that fed the family. Ploughs were shared among neighbors, loaned and borrowed, maintained collectively. A village without a plough was a village that would starve. Every tool had its place in the survival equation. Every object represented work, value, life. Peasants didn't own much, but what they owned completely. These tools were extensions of their bodies, partners in the endless work of staying alive. When a tool broke, it was a crisis. Repairs were attempted, often successfully, with whatever materials were available. If repairs failed, the tool might have to be replaced, which meant spending money that could have gone to food or fuel. The economics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. Children learned to use tools early. A 5-year-old could gather sticks. A 7-year-old could help with spinning. A 10-year-old could help with spinning. A 10-year-old could handle a small axe. By adolescence, they were proficient in all the skills they would need as adults. There was no childhood free from work, only childhood shaped by work. The winter night. Let me take you through a winter night in real time, from dusk to dawn, so you can feel what it was like. Dusk falls early, the sun setting behind bare trees, casting long shadows across the snow. The temperature drops rapidly, the warmth of the day, such as it was, bleeding away into the darkening sky. Families hurry to finish outdoor tasks, bringing in last bits of wood, checking on animals, securing doors. Inside, the fire is built up. The evening meal is prepared, a simple pottage of grain and whatever vegetables remain. Everyone eats from the same pot, dipping bread or spooning the thin liquid into bowls. There's not much, but there's enough. Enough for tonight. After the meal, the fire is allowed to die down slightly. Fuel must be conserved. The family gathers close, sharing warmth, telling stories, singing songs. The grandmother's voice is strong tonight, her tales of winter's past holding everyone's attention. The children listen, half asleep, their heads on their mother's lap. The father checks the animals one last time, making sure they're settled, that the cow has enough straw, that the chickens are safe from predators. He comes back inside, stamping snow from his feet, and takes his place by the fire. Bedtime approaches. The straw mattress is fluffed, fresh hay added if any remains. The family arranges themselves strategically, the weakest in the warmer spots, the strongest on the edges. They cover themselves with every scrap of cloth they own. Wool and linen and old sheepskins piled high. The fire is banked carefully, ash spread over the embers, a final piece of wood placed where it will burn slowly through the night. The father will wake once or twice to check it, adding fuel if needed, adjusting the ash. It's a skill learned over years, and he's good at it. The last light fades. The house is dark except for the faint glow of the banked fire. Sounds fill the darkness. Breathing, snoring, the rustle of straw, the cow's soft lowing, the wind outside. The family sleeps. In the middle of the night, the father wakes. The fire needs attention. He rises quietly, careful not to disturb the others, and pads to the hearth. The embers are still alive, glowing red beneath the ash. He adds a small piece of wood, adjusts the covering, waits until it catches. Then he returns to his place, settling back into the warmth of his family. The night continues. The cold presses against the walls, finds the cracks, seeps in around the edges. But the fire holds, the bodies hold, the family holds. Dawn comes slowly, grey light seeping through the smoke hole, through the cracks around the door. The father wakes first, as always. He checks the fire, finds it still alive, and begins the process of building it up for the day. The mother stirs, then the children. One by one, they emerge from the pile of blankets, blinking in the dim light. Another night survived. Another day to face. The fire crackles to life, and the family gathers around it, preparing for whatever the day will bring. This is the medieval winter night. Not dramatic, not eventful, just repeated night after night, week after week, month after month. Just survival, quiet and persistent, and absolutely necessary. The memory of warmth. When you've been cold long enough, you forget what warmth feels like. Not intellectually, not in the way that you know summer was warm, but physically, in your bones, in your memory of sensation. You remember that warmth existed, but you can't feel it anymore. Medieval peasants lived with this forgetting for months every year. The cold became normal, expected, the background of existence. They forgot what it felt like to be truly warm, to move without shivering, to sit without huddling. And then, in spring, the sun would shine with real warmth, and they would remember. The feeling would come back, flooding through bodies that had forgotten it was possible. They would stand in the sun and soak it in, unable to get enough, their skin drinking light like water. This memory of warmth sustained them through the next winter. They would close their eyes on cold nights and remember spring, remember the sun on their faces, remember what it felt like to be warm. The memory wasn't as good as the real thing, but it was something. It was hope. The very old might forget again, their minds failing along with their bodies. They would ask in the depths of winter whether spring would ever come. They would need to be reassured, comforted, reminded that warmth existed and would return. Children born in winter had never known warmth. They had to be told about it, taught that the world wasn't always cold, that the sun would eventually feel good instead of just pale and weak. Their first experience of real warmth, their first spring, was a revelation they would remember all their lives. The memory of warmth, the anticipation of spring, the knowledge that winter always ended. These were psychological tools as important as any physical object. They kept people going when going was hard. They provided hope when hope was scarce. The stories they told. Let's sit by that fire for a while and listen to the stories. Because the stories mattered. They weren't just entertainment. They were survival tools in their own right. The grandmother tells a story about the winter of 1315, the Great Famine. She wasn't there, of course, but her grandmother was, and she passed down the tale. The rain that wouldn't stop, the crops that rotted in the fields, the people who ate grass and bark and each other. The children listen, wide-eyed. They've heard this story before, but it never loses its power. They know that winter can be like that, can be worse than anything they've experienced. They know that survival isn't guaranteed, that the fire could go out, that the food could run out. But the story also teaches them something else. It teaches them that people survived, that the grandmother's grandmother made it through, that there is precedent for hope, evidence that the worst can be endured. Another story, this one about a saint, Saint Martin, who shared his cloak with a beggar on a cold night and woke to find that Christ had appeared to him in a dream. The moral is clear. Share what you have, even when it's not much, because you never know what divine purpose your sharing might serve. The children absorbed this too. They learn that generosity is valued, that community matters, that the bonds between people are as important as any physical resource. They learn that being good matters, even in a world that often seems cruel and indifferent. Stories about animals, about clever peasants who outwit greedy lords, about fools who do foolish things and suffer the consequences. Stories that teach lessons, that pass on wisdom, that entertain during the long dark hours. The grandmother's voice rises and falls, a rhythm as familiar as breathing. The fire crackles. The children's eyes grow heavy. The stories weave themselves into dreams, into memory, into the fabric of who these children will become. Years from now, these children will tell these same stories to their own children. The grandmother's voice will echo in their voices, her words preserved across generations. The stories will change slightly, adapted to new circumstances, but the call will remain, the wisdom of survival passed down through the long winter nights. The winter saints beyond the stories told by grandmothers. There was another layer of narrative that shaped how peasants understood winter. The saints of the calendar marked the passing of the season, each with their own day, their own traditions, their own meaning. December brought St. Nicholas on the 6th, a bishop who gave gifts to children and protected sailors and the vulnerable. His feast was a bright spot in the deepening dark, a reminder that generosity existed even in a harsh world. Children might receive small gifts, nuts or dried fruits or little carved toys, tokens of love in the cold. St. Lucy came on the 13th, her name meaning light, her day marking the winter solstice in the old calendar. Girls dressed in white with crowns of candles, bringing light into the darkness. Her feast promised that the days would soon begin to lengthen, that the sun would return, that winter's grip would eventually loosen. Christmas itself was the great celebration, the birth of light into the world. Even peasants celebrated with whatever food could be spared, with songs and prayers and perhaps a bit of ale. The 12 days of Christmas stretch from December 25th to January 6th, a respite from work, a time of feasting and visiting and joy. But January brought the cold in earnest. St. Anthony's Day on the 17th was marked by blessings of animals, the beasts that shared the peasants' homes and lives. Fires were blessed, protection sought against the disease that could sweep through a village and leave nothing behind. Candlemas, on February 2nd, marked the midpoint of winter, the point when half the cold was supposedly over. Candles were blessed and carried in procession, their light pushing back the darkness. If Candlemas was fair and bright, the saying went, winter would have another flight. If it brought clouds and rain, winter would not come again. Weather prediction mixed with faith, observation with tradition. St. Valentine's Day on the 14th, little celebrated by peasants as romance, but noted as the time when birds began to pair, when the first hints of spring stirred in the natural world. A small hope, a tiny promise. And then came spring with its own saints, its own celebrations, its own renewal. But in the depths of winter, the saints' days marked time, gave structure to the endless cold, reminded people that the calendar was turning, that spring existed, that winter would eventually end. The work of winter was not a time of rest for medieval peasants, despite what you might think. There was always work to do, always tasks that couldn't wait for spring. Indoor work filled the long dark hours. Women spun wool into thread, their wheels humming in the firelight. They wove cloth on looms that took up half the house. They sewed and patched, extending the life of every garment, turning rags into something useful. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, mended harnesses and yokes. They carved wood into spoons and bowls, into handles for axes and hoes, into anything the household needed. They worked leather, shaping it into shoes and bags and straps. Children had their tasks too. The smallest ones carded wool, pulling fibers straight for spinning. Older children helped with weaving, with mending, with all the endless handwork that kept a household running. When weather permitted, there was outdoor work. Wood had to be gathered, cut and stacked. Animals had to be fed and watered, their stalls cleaned, their health monitored. If the snow wasn't too deep, people might venture to nearby woods to hunt or trap, adding fresh meat to the dwindling stores. The hardest work was fetching water, Streams and wells froze, requiring ice to be broken, water to be carried sometimes long distances. Spills meant soaked clothing, which in winter could be deadly. Every trip for water was a calculated risk, weighed against the need for drinking, cooking, cleaning. Baking happened less often in winter, but when it did, it was an event. The oven, if a village had one, would be fired up, and everyone would bring their dough to be baked. The warmth of the oven house was a luxury, a place to linger, to gossip, to share news while bread baked. Brewing also continued through winter. Ale was safer to drink than water, which could carry disease. It also provided calories, warmth, a bit of cheer in the dark months. Women brewed in their homes, the smell of fermenting grain mixing with wood smoke and animals. And always there was the fire. The endless need for fuel meant that someone was always cutting, carrying, stacking, feeding. The fire was a mouth that never stopped eating, a hunger that could never be fully satisfied. All winter long, peasants fed it, and it kept them alive. The hunger gap. By late winter, the stored food was running low. This period, called the hunger gap by historians, was the most dangerous time of the year. The autumn harvest was months behind. The spring harvest was months ahead, and in between, there was only whatever remained in the larders. The hunger gap hit different families differently. Those who had planned well, who had stored extra, who had preserved everything possible, might have enough to see them through. Those who had been unlucky, whose harvest had been poor, who had more mouths to feed than expected, might be staring at empty shelves with weeks still to go. This was when the community mattered most. Families with surplus shared with those without, knowing that next year the roles might be reversed. Loans of grain were made, to be repaid after the harvest. Meals were shared, stretched thin to include extra mouths. But sometimes sharing wasn't enough. Sometimes the whole village faced the hunger gap together, every family running low, every larder nearly empty. Then came the desperate measures. Wild foods became essential. Nettles, if they could be found, were boiled into a nutritious pottage. Dandelions and other early greens were gathered at the first sign of growth. Roots were dug from the forest floor, carefully identified to avoid poisoning. In coastal villages, the shore provided. Seaweed could be eaten, though it was tough and salty. Shellfish could be gathered at low tide, though the risk of poisoning was real. Fish could be caught, if boats could be launched through the ice. Inland villages had fewer options. They might dig for tubers, hunt for any animal desperate enough to be caught, set snares for rabbits and hares. They might boil bones that had already been boiled, extracting the last bits of marrow and fat. Children felt the hunger most acutely. Their growing bodies needed food that wasn't there. They became listless, weak, prone to illness. Parents watched them with desperate eyes, counting the days until spring, praying that the children would hold on. The hunger gap broke when the first greens appeared, not the cultivated crops which wouldn't be ready for months, but the wild plants that pushed through the soil as soon as it thawed. Sorrel and chickweed, dandelion and nettle. Anything green and edible was gathered and eaten with a fervor that modern people can barely imagine. These first greens weren't just food, they were medicine, providing vitamins that had been missing for months. They were proof that winter was ending, that life was returning, that the hunger would eventually be satisfied. The return of light somewhere, in late January or early February, the change became noticeable. Not in temperature, which remained stubbornly cold. Not in snow, which continued to fall. But in light. The days were longer. The sun, when it appeared, climbed higher in the sky. The darkness that had pressed so heavily since November began to retreat, grudgingly at first, then more perceptibly. Peasants noticed. They always noticed. The extra hour of daylight meant more time to work, more time to gather fuel, more time to prepare for spring. It meant that the worst was over, that the sun hadn't abandoned them forever, that light would return. They marked the change with small celebrations. Candles burned a little longer. Fires were allowed to blaze a little brighter. People smiled more, talked more, felt hope stirring in their chests. The old ones knew not to get too hopeful. February could be brutal, with storms as bad as any in January. March could bring false springs, teasing with warmth before plunging back into cold. The worst blizzards often came late, catching the unwary who had relaxed their vigilance. But still, the light mattered. It changed everything. It meant that the cycle was turning, that winter would not last forever, that spring was real and would eventually arrive. Children who had been born in autumn experienced their first lengthening days with wonder. What was this strange brightness that lingered after the fire was lit? Why did the world stay visible longer? They learned, as all children learned, that the world was governed by rhythms they didn't yet understand. The old ones remembered. They had seen dozens of winters, dozens of returns of light. They knew that each one was different, that some springs came early and some late, that nothing was certain but change itself. They watched the light and waited, patient as the seasons themselves. The late winter crisis, just when hope was highest, when people allowed themselves to think about spring, that's when the worst storms often hit. Late winter, February into March, brought blizzards that could bury villages, kill animals, trap people in their homes for days. These storms were different from the steady cold of deep winter. They came with wind that howled like living things, with snow so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, with temperatures that plunged to depths not seen since January. Houses that had survived all winter might suddenly fail. Roofs collapsed under the weight of fresh snow. Walls gave way to wind that found every weakness. Doors were buried so deep they couldn't be opened, trapping families inside with no way to reach fuel or food. Animals died in these storms, even those brought inside. The cold was simply too intense, too prolonged. A cow that had survived all winter might succumb in a single night of blizzard, her body finally giving out. People died too. The old and weak, already pushed to their limits, couldn't survive another extreme. The young, their bodies stressed by months of poor nutrition, fell to illnesses that wouldn't have killed in summer. Even the strong could be caught outside when a storm blew up, freezing to death steps from their own door. These late winter crises were the cruelest because they came when people had already endured so much. To survive months of cold and hunger, only to be killed by a storm in March, seemed impossibly unfair. And yet it happened, year after year, in villages across Europe. Those who survived the late storms emerged to a transformed world. Snow so deep that paths had to be dug, tunnels carved through drifts that reached the eaves of houses, animals buried in their shelters, frozen solid, trees split by cold, their branches littering the ground. The work of recovery began immediately. Paths had to be cleared to reach fuel and food. Bodies had to be retrieved and stored for later burial. Survivors had to be checked on, helped, brought into houses that still stood. And through it all, the knowledge that spring was coming, the light was stronger now, the sun higher. Even the worst blizzard couldn't stop the turning of the seasons. Winter would end. It always ended. The first thaw. It started with sounds. The drip of water from eaves, slower first, then faster. The trickle of tiny streams forming where snow melted. The groan of ice shifting on ponds and rivers preparing to break. Peasants heard these sounds with something close to joy. The thaw had begun. Not the full arrival of spring, not yet, but the beginning of the end. Winter was loosening its grip. The work of thaw was messy. Mud everywhere, deep and clinging, making every step an effort. Paths became quagmires. Floors, always dirt, became soupy messes that never quite dried. Animals came in and out, tracking mud with them, adding to the general chaos. But the mess was welcome. It meant warmth. It meant life. It meant that soon the ground would be workable, the seeds could be planted, the cycle could begin again. Children played in the mud, their joy undimmed by the cold that still lingered in the air. They splashed through puddles, built dams in the rushing water, came home covered in filth that their mothers pretended to scold them for. After months cooped up inside, the freedom was intoxicating. The first green shoots appeared in sheltered spots, pushing through the mud with incredible determination. Peasants watched them like hawks, protecting them from animals, from children, from anything that might damage them. Those shoots were life, literally. Birds returned, their songs filling the air. Migratory species that had fled south for winter reappeared, their calls strange and wonderful after months of silence. They built nests, laid eggs, began the cycle of their own. The village transformed. Doors stood open during daylight, letting in fresh air for the first time in months. People gathered outside, talking, laughing, simply enjoying the sensation of being outdoors without freezing. Animals were let out to pasture, their joy at freedom as obvious as the children's. But winter wasn't done yet. There would be more cold, more snow, more freezing nights. The thaw could reverse, the warm spell could end, and winter could return with renewed fury. Peasants knew this, had seen it happen, and kept their guard up even as they celebrated. Still, the first thaw was a milestone. It marked the point of no return. Winter might fight back, might delay, might cause more suffering, but it couldn't win. Spring would come. It always came. The spring planting, with the ground finally workable. The most urgent task of the year began. The spring planting wasn't just important, it was everything. Without it, there would be no harvest, no food for next winter, no survival. Everyone worked. Men guided plows if they had them, breaking the soil that had frozen solid for months. Women followed, dropping seeds into the furrows. Children walked behind, covering the seeds with soil, their small hands perfect for the task. The work was back-breaking, hours bent over, dropping seeds one by one, covering them carefully. Feet sank into mud, making every step a struggle. Hands grew raw and cold despite the warming weather. But no one complained. Not really. This was the work of life. Different crops went in at different times. The hardiest grains, rye and wheat, were planted first, then the vegetables, peas and beans and onions. Then the tenderer crops, those that couldn't survive any frost, had to wait until all danger was past. Every seed was precious. The ones planted now were the ones that had been saved from last year's harvest, guarded through winter, protected from mice and mold. To waste a seed was unthinkable. Each one represented a potential meal, a potential life. Prayers accompanied the planting. Priests blessed fields, sprinkling holy water, asking God to make the seeds grow. Families said their own prayers, less formal but just as fervent. Saints were invoked, each with their own specialty, their own power to help. Superstition mixed with faith. Some buried charms in the fields, bits of metal or bone that they believed would ensure a good harvest. Others performed rituals, leaping and dancing in ways that mimicked the growth they hoped to see. The line between religion and magic was blurry, and peasants crossed it without noticing. The work continued for weeks. Dawn to dusk, every hand needed, every moment precious. If the planting was delayed, the harvest would be delayed, and next winter's food supply would be threatened. There was no room for error, no time for rest. And when the last seed was in the ground, when the last field was planted, the village paused. Not to rest, there was always more work, but to breathe, to hope, to wait. Now came the waiting, the watching, the praying that the weather would hold, that the rains would come at the right time, that the sun would warm without scorching, that the seeds would grow. The sheep shearing spring brought other work besides planting. For villages with sheep, shearing was a major event. The wool that had kept sheep warm through winter now needed to be removed, processed, and prepared for spinning and weaving. Shearing was skilled work, done with sharp shears that could easily cut the sheep if handled wrong. Experienced shearers moved quickly, stripping the fleece in one piece, leaving the sheep naked and confused but unharmed. The wool was greasy, full of lanolin and dirt. It had to be washed, carded, and prepared for spinning. Women did this work, their hands moving through the fibers, straightening and aligning them until they were ready for the wheel. Children helped, their small hands useful for picking out burrs and twigs that had become tangled in the wool. They learned the work early, their fingers developing the sensitivity needed to feel imperfections that eyes might miss. The The wool would be spun into thread throughout the year, then woven into cloth. Some would be used for the family's own clothing, some sold or traded for things the village couldn't produce itself. Wool was wealth, as valuable as grain in its own way. The shearing also marked a change in the sheep's lives. Freed from their heavy coats, they could enjoy the warming weather without overheating. They would spend the summer grazing, building up the fat that would help them survive next winter, growing new wool that would be harvested the following spring. Everything was a cycle: sheep, crops, people. Winter, spring, summer, autumn. Birth, growth, death, renewal. The peasants lived inside these cycles, shaped by them, dependent on them, part of them. The summer's work. Summer brought its own challenges. The work was endless, the days long, the heat sometimes as oppressive as winter's cold. But summer work was different. It was work of growth, of abundance, of life. Haymaking came first. The grass that had grown lush in spring had to be cut, dried, and stored as feed for animals through next winter. This was race against weather. Hay that got wet would rot, useless for feeding. Families worked frantically during dry spells, cutting and turning and stacking before rain could ruin their efforts. Children helped with haymaking, their small bodies useful for spreading grass to dry, for gathering it into piles, for carrying water to thirsty workers. They learned to read the sky, to predict rain, to know when to work faster and when to give up and wait. Then came weeding. The crops that had been planted in spring now competed with weeds for sunlight and nutrients. Women and children spent hours in the fields, pulling unwanted plants, protecting the precious grain. It was tedious work, back-breaking in its own way, but essential. The gardens needed constant attention. Vegetables had to be watered, pests discouraged, ripe produce harvested before it spoiled. The first fruits of summer, peas and early greens, were greeted with joy after months of winter diet. Fresh food tasted like nothing else, like life itself. Berries ripened in the hedgerows, and everyone who could be spared went gathering. Wild strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, blackberries, all were collected and eaten fresh or preserved for winter. Children came home with stained hands and faces, their bellies full of sweetness. The animals required attention too. They had to be moved to fresh pasture, watered, watched for signs of illness. The cow that would provide milk through next winter needed to be bred, her calf the promise of future dairy. Pigs rooted in the woods, fattening on acorns and beech nuts, destined for autumn slaughter. And always there was the constant work of maintenance. Houses needed repair, tools needed sharpening, clothes needed mending. The work of survival never stopped, even in summer's abundance. But summer had joys too. The warmth on your skin after months of cold, the taste of fresh food, the long daylight that seemed to stretch forever, the feeling of life bursting forth everywhere, in the fields, in the woods, in your own body. People fell in love in summer, courted and married. Babies were conceived in summer nights, their births timed for spring when the worst of winter was past. Life pushed forward, persistent and joyful despite everything. The autumn harvest. If spring planting was urgent, autumn harvest was desperate. The entire year's work, the entire winter survival, depended on getting the crops in before weather could destroy them. The grain ripened all at once, or seemed to. Suddenly, fields that had been green were gold, heavy with wheat and rye and barley. Every hand was needed, every minute counted. Families worked from before dawn until after dark, cutting the grain with sickles, bundling it into sheaves, stacking it to dry. The work was brutal, bent over for hours, cutting each stalk by hand, moving slowly through fields that seemed endless. Backs ached, hands blistered, muscles screamed, but no one stopped. Stopping meant losing food meant dying. Children worked alongside adults, their small hands useful for gathering, for tying sheaves, for carrying bundles. They learned the rhythm of harvest, the desperate pace, the importance of every single stalk. After the grain came the vegetables. Potatoes, if they had them, had to be dug, turnips and carrots pulled, onions harvested and braided into strings for hanging. Cabbages cut, their dense heads stored in cellars or made into sauerkraut that would last through winter. Fruits were gathered from trees, apples and pears and plums. Some would be eaten fresh, a brief luxury. Most would be dried or made into preserves, their sweetness saved for winter's dark days. Nuts were collected from the woods, hazels and walnuts and chestnuts. Children competed to find the most, their rivalry filling baskets with protein-rich food that would supplement winter's grain. The slaughter came in late autumn after the first frost, but before deep winter. Animals that couldn't be fed through winter, the extra pigs, the old sheep, the worn-out hens, were killed and processed. Their meat was salted, smoked, or dried, preserved for the months ahead. Blood was made into puddings. Fat was rendered for cooking. Organs were eaten fresh, a feast after months of grain. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. The work of autumn was frantic, exhausting, terrifying. One bad storm could flatten the standing grain. One early frost could kill the vegetables. One mistake in preservation could ruin meat that was supposed to last all winter. But when the last sheaf was in the barn, the last vegetable in the cellar, the last sausage hanging from the rafters, the village could breathe. The year's work was done. Winter was coming, but they were ready as they could be. The winter preparation. Even as they harvested, peasants prepared for winter. The two tasks overlapped, the urgency of one feeding into the urgency of the other. Firewood had to be gathered, cut and stacked. Lots of it. More than seemed possible. The fire would burn through an astonishing amount of wood over the winter, and running out was not an option. Every spare moment was spent in the woods gathering fuel. The house needed attention. Cracks that had opened over summer had to be plugged. The roof had to be checked. Thatch replaced where it had thinned. The door needed to fit as snugly as possible, shutting out drafts that would steal warmth. Straw for bedding had to be gathered and stored. Fresh, clean straw that would insulate sleepers from the cold ground, enough to last through months of use, to replace when it flattened and fouled. Clothing needed mending, every hole patched, every weak spot reinforced. Nothing could be spared. Nothing could be spared. Nothing thrown away. The clothes that had served through last winter would serve through this one too, with careful attention. Food storage was checked and rechecked. The grain in its bins, safe from mice and moisture. The salted meat in its barrels, covered with brine. The dried fruit in its bags, hanging from rafters where air could circulate. Everything counted, everything measured, everything guarded. Tools were sharpened and oiled, ready for use. The axe that would cut wood, the sickle that might be needed for unexpected tasks, the knife that served 100 purposes. Tools were precious, and winter was hard on them. The animals were brought closer to the house, their shelters reinforced, their feed stores checked. The cow that would share the family's home through winter needed to be healthy, strong, ready for months indoors. And then, one day, it was done. The last task completed. The last preparation made. Winter stood at the door, and the peasants were as ready as they could be. They gathered for one last autumn meal, a feast of fresh meat and vegetables, of bread from new grain, of ale brewed from this year's harvest. They ate and drank and told stories, celebrating the work they'd done, the food they'd stored, the survival they'd prepared for. Tomorrow, winter would begin. Tonight, they celebrated being alive. The first snow, it always came as a shock, even though they knew it was coming. The first snow of winter, falling silently, transforming the world. Children ran out to catch flakes on their tongues, to throw snow at each other, to revel in the novelty. Adults watched from doorways, their expressions mixed. Relief that winter had finally arrived, no more waiting. Dread at what was to come. The first snow rarely lasted. It would melt, sometimes within hours, leaving behind wet and mud. But it was a warning, a promise. Winter was here. More snow would follow, each fall deeper than the last, each lasting longer. The world would gradually turn white, then stay white, the snow piling up against walls, burying paths, covering everything. The first real cold came after the snow, a deep freeze that turned the white crust to ice, that made every breath visible, that crept into houses despite all precautions. The fire that had seemed adequate in autumn now seemed pathetically small, its warmth barely reaching beyond the hearth. But the peasants were ready. The wood was stacked, the food was stored, the animals were inside, the family was together. They settled into winter routine, the rhythm of survival that would carry them through to spring. The fire was fed, the meals were stretched, the stories were told. The days passed one after another, each a victory, each a step closer to spring. The first snow marked the beginning. What followed was endurance. The deep cold January and February brought the deepest cold. The kind of cold that froze water inside the house, that turned bread to stone, that made the fire's warmth seem like a cruel joke. On the worst nights, families didn't even try to sleep in separate beds. They all piled together, the largest pile of bodies they could manage, covered with every scrap of cloth they owned. The cow was brought as close as possible, her massive body radiating heat that supplemented the struggling fire. Babies were held against mother's skin, their tiny bodies drawing warmth from the adults, even as they contributed their own small heat. Old people were wrapped and re-wrapped, their fragile bodies protected as much as possible. Everyone shared, everyone contributed, everyone survived together. The cold affected everything. Food froze in storage, requiring careful thawing before it could be eaten. Water had to be melted from snow or ice, a slow process that consumed fuel. Hands and feet went numb even indoors, requiring constant attention to avoid frostbite. Outdoor work was minimized, but some tasks couldn't be avoided. Animals still needed care. Fuel still needed to be brought in. Waste still needed to be disposed of. People went out bundled in every layer they owned, moving quickly, returning as fast as possible. The darkness compounded the cold. Short days meant long nights, hours of huddling by the fire, waiting for dawn. The sun, when it appeared, was weak and distant, offering light but no real warmth. The world seemed dead, frozen, waiting, and yet life continued. Babies were born in the deep cold, entering a world of ice and snow. Their first cries echoed in smoky houses, their tiny bodies wrapped in whatever warmth could be provided. Some survived, some didn't. Those who did were marked for life, their very existence a testament to their mother's determination. People died too, the old, the weak, the unlucky. Their bodies were stored, frozen solid, waiting for ground that could be dug. The village shrank, its population culled by winter's relentless pressure. But the survivors pressed on. They had no choice. The fire still needed feeding. The children still needed care. Life still demanded to be lived. The midwinter feast, in the darkest part of winter, around the shortest day, came a celebration. Christmas, in Christian terms. Yule, in older traditions, a feast in the middle of scarcity, a defiance of winter's grip. Families brought out their best remaining food. The last of the fresh meat, if any, remained. Special bread, made with precious white flour. Preserved fruits, saved for just this occasion. Ale that had been brewing since autumn. The feast was more than just food. It was a statement. We are still here. We are still alive. Winter has not defeated us. People gathered in the largest house, squeezing in as many as could fit. They ate and drank and told stories. They sang songs that had been sung for generations, their voices rising against the cold. They laughed, actually laughed, the sound strange after months of quiet. Children received small gifts, a carved toy, a handful of nuts, a piece of honey candy. Nothing much, but everything in the context of winter. They treasured these gifts, played with them quietly, saved them for the long days ahead. The feast lasted only one night, sometimes two, then it was back to survival, back to rationing, back to waiting. But something had changed. The darkness had been pushed back, if only briefly. The light had been celebrated. Spring was still months away, but the worst was over. The days would now grow longer, the sun stronger, the cold eventually less. The midwinter feast was a pivot point, a turning of the year. After it, peasants marked time differently, not as waiting for spring, but as moving toward spring. Each day brought more light, each week brought more hope. The late winter thaw. Sometime in late February or early March, depending on the year, came the false spring. A few days of warmth, of melting snow, of dripping eaves. The world seemed to wake, to stir, to promise renewal. Peasants reacted with joy and caution. They knew the false spring for what it was, a trick, a tease. Winter would return, probably with fury, but still the warmth felt good. Still, the melting was progress. They used the thaw to accomplish tasks that had been impossible in deep cold. Water was fetched easily, no ice to break. Animals were let out briefly, enjoying the chance to move. Paths were cleared, the slush shoveled aside. Children played in the mud with abandon, their laughter echoing off houses that had been silent for months. They didn't understand the caution their parents felt. They only knew that it was warm, that the sun felt good, that they could run and shout without freezing. The thaw inevitably ended. The cold returned, sometimes with snow, sometimes with ice that turned paths into skating rinks. The world froze again, seemingly as hard as ever. But something was different. The snow was less deep, the cold was less intense. The days were visibly longer. The late winter storms came as they always did. Blizzards that dumped snow, winds that howled, temperatures that plunged. But peasants endured them with new knowledge. These were the last gasps. Winter was dying, even if it fought to the end. They huddled through the storms, counting the days, watching the light. They knew that each storm made spring more certain, that winter was exhausting itself in these final attacks. They held on as they had held on all winter, and waited. The first signs. They came all at once, it seemed. One day, the world was still winter. The next, spring was everywhere. The snow melted in earnest, revealing the ground beneath. It was brown and soggy, and absolutely beautiful. Mud appeared, deep and unavoidable, but welcome. Mud meant warmth. Mud meant life. Mud meant life. Birds arrived, their songs filling the air. Not just the hardy ones that had stayed all winter, but migrants returning from the south. Their calls were strange and wonderful, a soundtrack of renewal. The first green shoots pushed through the soil. Not the crops, not yet, but the wild things. Nettles and dandelions, chickweed and sorrel. Peasants gathered them eagerly, boiling them into pottage that tasted of life itself. Animals gave birth. Lambs appeared in the fields, their bleating adding to the chorus. Calves stumbled after their mothers. Chicks hatched, tiny balls of fluff that promised eggs and meat to come. The village transformed. Doors stood open. People gathered outside. Work resumed at a pace that would have seemed impossible months ago. The fields needed preparing. The gardens needed planting. The endless cycle was beginning again, and through it all, peasants looked at each other with something like wonder. They had survived. Another winter had been defeated. They were still here, still alive, still together. The old ones counted the missing. Those who hadn't made it, their names were spoken, their memories honored. They would be remembered in next winter's stories, examples of what could happen, warnings and inspirations both. The children who had survived were stronger now, tougher, more aware. They had learned what winter meant, what survival cost, what life demanded. They would carry these lessons forever, and the cycle continued. Summer's growth, autumn's harvest, winter's trial, spring's renewal. Over and over, generation after generation, the peasants lived and died and lived again in the eternal return of the seasons. The village at spring. Let's look at the village now, in full spring. The transformation is complete. The houses that seemed so grim in winter now look almost charming. Smoke rises from their roofs, but gently, without the desperate urgency of winter. Doors stand open, revealing interiors that are being cleaned, aired, prepared for warmer months. The mud is drying, paths are being repaired. Fences that collapsed under snow are being rebuilt. Everything is activity, motion, life. Children run everywhere, their energy seemingly boundless after months of confinement. They chase each other through the village, their shouts echoing off houses. They climb trees, splash in puddles, roll in grass that is just beginning to green. Adults work in the fields, preparing soil, planting seeds. Their movements are steady, practiced, efficient. They talk as they work, sharing news, making plans, enjoying the simple pleasure of being outdoors. Animals graze in pastures, their coats shedding, their bodies relaxing after winter's confinement. The cow that shared the family's home now stands in the sun, swishing her tail, seeming to smile. The church bells ring, calling people to prayer. They gather, filing into the stone building that has sheltered their worship through all seasons. They give thanks for survival, for spring, for life itself. The cemetery holds new graves, marked with simple wooden crosses. The dead are not forgotten, but they are at peace. The living carry on, as they must. And in the houses, preparations for next winter have already begun. Not urgently, not desperately, but steadily. Seeds are being saved, tools are being repaired, knowledge is being passed down, because winter will come again. It always comes, and the peasants will be ready as they can be, to face it together. The story's end. As we come to the close of our journey through the medieval winter, let's step back from the frozen fields and smoky huts. Let's look at the bigger picture, at what all of this means, at why their story still matters today. The peasants we've been talking about, these anonymous millions who lived and died in obscurity, they weren't just surviving for themselves. They were surviving for us, every child who made it through winter, every family that held together, every village that's endured. They were passing on something precious. Not just genes, though that too, but something more, a template for resilience, a proof that humans can endure almost anything. Think about what they accomplished. Without modern technology, without government assistance, without any of the safety nets we take for granted, they kept civilization alive. They grew the food that fed the towns and cities. They raised the children who would become the next generation. They maintained the knowledge and skills that would eventually lead to everything we have today. The knight in his castle, the merchant in his townhouse, the king in his palace. None of them could exist without the peasant in his hut. The entire medieval world, with all its cathedrals and universities and courts, rested on the bowed backs of people who spent their winters huddled against the cold, praying to see another dawn. And they knew it, not in the way we understand it, not with statistics and economic analyses, but in their bones. They knew that the world depended on them. They knew that their work mattered, that their suffering had meaning, that their survival was necessary. That knowledge kept them going through the worst nights, when the fire burned low and the wind howled and a child coughed in the darkness. They remembered that spring would come, that the fields would green, that life would continue. They held onto that knowledge like a talisman, like a prayer, like a promise. The last ember. Let's return one final time to that peasant hut on a winter night. The fire has burned low. The family sleeps. The cow breathes slowly in her corner. The wind has died, and the world is still. In the hearth, buried under ash, a single ember glows. It's small, almost invisible, easy to miss, but it's there. It's still there. That ember is everything. It's the heat that will restart the fire in the morning. It's the warmth that will cook the next day's food. It's the light that will push back the darkness. It's life refusing to die. The peasants understood the ember. They understood that survival wasn't about grand gestures or heroic acts. It was about the small things, the daily choices, the stubborn refusal to give up. It was about banking the fire, sharing the warmth, telling the stories, planting the seeds. It was about one more day, one more night, one more breath. They passed that understanding down to us. We are their embers. Every time we face hardship and keep going, we're channeling their spirit. Every time we help a neighbor in need, we're practicing their community. Every time we gather with loved ones on a cold night, we're continuing their tradition. The medieval peasants are gone, their names are forgotten, their individual stories lost to time, but their legacy lives on in every person who refuses to give up, in every community that pulls together, in every small act of courage and kindness. They are free, accompanied by slave skits, the everyday heroes of history. And now, when you feel the cold or face your own personal winter, you'll know that you come from people who survived worse. You'll know that resilience is in your blood, passed down through countless generations of people who refused to die. The fire burns on. So here we are, at the end of our journey. We've traveled through medieval winters, through frozen nights and desperate days. We've met the peasants who somehow kept going, who found ways to survive against all odds. Their story is our story. Their blood runs in our veins. Their resilience lives in our hearts. The next time you're warm and comfortable, maybe spare a thought for them, the nameless millions who endured so that we could exist. The forgotten heroes who kept the fire burning through the longest, coldest nights. And the next time you face your own winter, whatever form it takes, remember them. Remember that humans have survived worse. Remember that the ember can always be rekindled. Remember that spring always comes if you can hold on long enough to see it. The medieval peasants survived. They survived through ingenuity and stubbornness and community and faith. They survived because they had to, because the alternative was unthinkable, because life is precious even when it's hard. And we will survive too, because we carry their legacy, because the fire they tended still burns in us, because we are their descendants, their heirs, their living proof that winter never wins forever. The fire burns on, the story continues, and we are part of it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the lives of medieval peasants. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps me keep creating content like this. Drop a comment and let me know what you thought. What surprised you most about medieval winter survival? What would you have found hardest to endure? I read every comment, and I love hearing your perspectives. And if there are other historical topics you'd like me to explore, let me know in the comments. I'm always looking for new stories to tell. Until next time, stay warm, appreciate your modern comforts, and remember that history is full of everyday heroes who made our world possible. Good night, everyone.